footing back to the framework of energy, raw inputs, metals, commodities, increasingly becoming important as these legacy fiat credit monetary systems, um, basically rush for collateral at the base layer to reliquify the debt that's been built up in their own sovereign denominated currency units. We've got a big story here over the last 2 months with the Russian oil sanctions, in particular, the U.S. Treasury's forced divestiture of the Russian majors, Russian oil majors' international assets. Now, what do we mean by a Russian oil major? Think of this like if you're in the U.S., it's your Chevron or Exxon. Or if you're in Europe, think of Shell or Total Energies. But what the majors do is they're primarily involved in the cross-border, commodity flows of oil and potentially natural gas. But natural gas is a very new and emerging commodity in cross-border international trade. Oil, this story goes back, 120 years. We've had oil tankers since Marcus Shell, I think it was, came up with that invention and did the corporate roll up of Shell Oil, a British oil company, and combined it with Royal Dutch Oil to, form the company we now know as Royal Dutch Shell. But yeah, we've had oil tankers to transport oil from A to Z. We'll get into a story on that in a second, and connect some dots here, hopefully for you all. But what we saw in this Scott Bessent issued directive for Lukoil and Rosneft to sell their non-Russian, non-domestic oil interests. So could be gas station networks, could be pipelines, could be refineries, could be exploration and development projects. Those had to be sold with a deadline of December 13th. Now, as of this week, we got an extension on that deadline. It's now 5 weeks from now. We're looking at a January 17th drop dead date. And we've now got a story shaping up on how this could play out. So far, this looks like the most reasonable option, and we'll get into that. So I think media reports have mentioned there's been 12 bids for these international oil assets. It's been a very messy process. This is something that is very difficult for a buyer to come in and, complete its due diligence on in a 7-8 week period. That was, essentially what was provided under that original deadline, right? So, and you're also dealing with a situation with internet asset sales, jurisdiction, property rights. It's legally gray here. And if any industry knows what it's like to have their property confiscated, or just general ambiguities of dealing in an unclear regulatory environment, the oil majors know what they're looking at here. So this is a very difficult thing to get done in a tight deadline. And I think we've got kind of a solution starting to take shape. So there's a firm that showed up, and people have been watching this story over the last decade or so might be familiar with this name. But this Xtellus Capital Partners showed up with the preferred bid among the 12, or I don't know if they said they had 12 other bids, which would make it 13, but 12 or 13 bids. This offer or proposal is essentially what Lukoil has said it leans towards, or it would prefer. When we say leans towards, this is a messy situation here. Essentially what you're looking at is a divorce type of scenario. You've got lawyers in the middle. Everybody's trying to figure out who's going to leave with what are some fair terms. But then also the lawyers themselves have an interest in the matter. So it's even messier than a messy divorce, if you can believe that. So if any of you have friends going through those type of situations, it's that level of stress that I think these people involved um, in the offices are having to deal with. So this is a cashless bid. What do they mean by that? What Xtellus is proposing is essentially an asset swap. So you've got a bunch of Lukoil shares. These things trade on the Russian exchange. It's about a 50 to 60 billion dollar market cap. Could be higher, could be lower. Obviously, prices are going to be distressed just given the state of um, Russian international relations as things have gone the last 10 to 15 years. But you're looking at, let's call it 50, 60 billion dollars. The estimate of the international assets that are in play in Lukoil's portfolio are roughly $22 billion is what you've seen. Now, of Lukoil's parent shares, the whole pie, about 25% of that, of the shareholder base is owned or was owned. Currently, these things are frozen, as is everything related to Russia at this point. That touches the Western financial systems. 25% is owned by U.S. investors, right? And that list includes BlackRock, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs. Just work your way down the list. Um, Lukoil equity, if you're looking at 2020, 2022, that type of time frame, these things were trading at, extremely suppressed PE multiples. Valuations were already low. All right. So what do you have right now? You've got a bunch of US broker dealers, asset managers, et cetera, who are just sitting on these, property claims on behalf of their owners, which are going to be US based investors for the most part. That 25% would be the consideration from the US side in this deal. And then those international assets would then spin out and sit in a new container, right? And that thing would be overseen by this Xtellus Capital Partners. Over time, short term, right? This has to get done sooner rather than later. Those international oil assets would then be kind of piecemeal carved out to their ultimate buyer, which would most likely be a U.S. oil major such as Chevron, Exxon, et cetera, or it could be a U.S.-based private equity company that's been mentioned, like a Carlyle Group, something like that. But that's generally the framework for how this, messy knot can get untied here with everybody. I don't want to say leaving happy because, nobody's happy when they have, gun to their head, someone forcing them to rid themselves of their property. It's never going to be a welcome situation. But we at least have a man in the middle here where we can structurally get something done without making a bad situation any worse, hopefully. So that's what we're looking at with the Russian Lukoil and Rosneft scenario. Now, this Xtellus Capital Partners, if you want to look into their history, they've got a legacy parent company, VTB, which was fully owned by a Russian entity. So there was a direct link to the Russian financial system since I want to say 2017 or 2018. And, as a result of the sanctions buildup towards Russia that had been ongoing since the early to mid 2010s, that link was severed. And this group called VTB spun off into Xtellus Capital Partners. Literally the same CEO, mostly the same personnel, just different legal entities, binding this whole thing together. So that's how we have this new middleman. Hopefully, this leads to at least a positive resolution, or at least something that is legally defensible without harming the United States reputation for defense of property rights, assurances, and protections that make it at least viewed in perception as a friendly place for international capital investment. So that's what we're dealing with here. You see on the company's website, literally like largest text. What stands out here? Xtellus is a New York-based broker-dealer and specialist investment bank. All right, New York-based, that tells you something. And then below that, I'd say we mobilize cross-border capital to deliver growth and long-term value. Cross-border, the key thing there. So that's the entity we're working with. Remember how we talked about a couple of weeks back in our update, the Gunvor proposal, the Swiss-based commodity trading house with Russian-friendly ties. This is the next best option from, let's say, the Russian perspective on the side of this transaction. And notably, kind of fulfilling the requirements of the OFAC directed divestiture. Can't deal, this transaction cannot operate through the US dollar, domestic financial system. So you're looking at a cashless asset swap to get this done. We'll see how this goes, but it actually looks like it may be able to work itself out. So that is, in some sense, a positive development. Cameron, any thoughts there, or
I
you
remember
want to move
coming
on to the
across
next
this,
story?
and
And
yeah, I thought your description of this is really tied it together for me. I think for our audience, I saw the Lukoil headline. I clearly read through the Xtellus piece and thought, this is an interesting company. Don't know much about it. For more specifically, though, the terms of the deal just really didn't make sense to me in terms of why this would be a beneficial piece, at least on the Lukoil side. But Matt, kind of explaining through the rails that you need to use or you're not allowed to use in this specific transaction, things like that, it starts to make a little more sense why you need to have some type of a buffer, right? A middleman in between the two. And it also makes a lot of
Mhm.
sense why Lukoil is going to prefer something like an Xtellus over, one of these other potential partners that maybe aren't as closely tied to their political affiliations as the other ones are.
So the net of this whole operation, I think if you're looking at this from the big picture, what does this net out to? If you look at the oil majors, I mentioned them, Chevron, Exxon, Shell, Total to some extent. Um, the Russian oil majors are essentially depeg, like they're moved a peg down, right? You're going to be left with a Lukoil and Rosneft that are stripped of their international assets, right? The comp after this is basically from a US standpoint, what's an analogy? It's like a Valero, a Marathon Petroleum, someone like that, where it's focused on domestic production, domestic distribution, domestic pipelines, and that sponsor, which really flies under the flag of the sovereign, in this specific global oil market, is essentially taken off the board, right? So you've removed a competitor in international markets. You get to the theme of it's in the word of the book, the prize, right? You're out of the you're out of the race. Um, so I think that's the net effect of this. Who wins? Probably going to be the U.S. oil industry who picks up the pieces of this one. Now, sometimes it's a Pyrrhic victory, right? We talked about oil companies operating in challenging jurisdictions, places where it's tough to defend your property rights, difficult to, lock in your distribution channels, all of that. It's a challenging market. These stories happen all the time. I know in our lifetime it feels like this is something new, but if you go back and read the prize, these
Been
things
happening for a long
pop up
time.
every few decades. Yep.